All right, let's talk about chapter 1 of Escape from Warsaw. As we read through this book, or as I read this book to you, periodically we're going to look at these notes right here. And they're always going to have the same sections. So we're always going to talk about first the setting of the chapter, because in this book, because it is historical fiction, the setting is very important, and it will change from chapter to chapter. We'll also talk about in each chapter the characters that are in that chapter, and they also will change from chapter to chapter, and the main character will change sometimes from chapter to chapter. Up here in the new and unfamiliar word box, that's when we'll talk about, did you hear a word in the chapter that I read that you had never heard before? Or maybe I might suggest a word that might be unfamiliar to you. Okay, down here in this box, we're going to talk about conflict. Remember, there's several different kinds of conflict. There's the internal conflict and external conflict. Internal conflict is character versus self, and it takes place inside the character. The character himself or herself will struggle with something. Then we have those external conflicts, man versus man. It's the same thing as if we said character versus character, man versus nature, man versus society. Okay, so those are some of the types of conflicts we'll talk about. In the box underneath conflict is the text connection box, and this is when we're going to talk about what the reading made you think of. Sometimes it might make you think of another book. That would be a text to text connection. Sometimes it might make you think about a similar situation that you've had, or a time when you felt the same way as the character in the story felt. That would be a text to self connection. Or it might be just something that you have seen on the news, or you know that's happening in the world, and that would be a text to world connection. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about how we would summarize the chapter. Remember, a summary is just a one or two sentences that give the main idea and what happened in the chapter. We don't want to put in a lot of descriptive words. We just want to stick to the facts, and that's just the bare essentials of what happened in the chapter. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. Of course, we've already talked about the setting of the story. In chapter 1, he's in Poland, and specifically the Zakina prison camp. It is still in World War II. We don't know the specific year. We do know that World War II started in Poland in 1939, so we can guess that this is right after it started, so we can guess it's around 1940. All right, so the characters in this chapter, we are introduced to the Balicki family. And even though it looks like we would pronounce it Balicki, it's actually in Polish pronounced Balicki. Okay, so as I read, hopefully I'll remember to call them the Balicki family. Okay, so we have Joseph, who's the dad of the family, Marguerite, who's the mom of the family, Ruth, who is the oldest child in the family, Eddick, who is the only boy in the family, but he's the middle child of the family, and then we have Branya, who's just a little girl at the beginning of this book. Okay, so that family is going to be really important through the whole book. But in chapter 1, it's Joseph who is the main character. He is the one that we read about. He's the only one doing anything um, throughout the whole chapter. Okay, so let's talk about, there we have, Joseph is the main character of chapter 1. Let's talk about an unfamiliar word from this chapter. When I read, I talked about Joseph making a catapult out of part of his clothing. I believe it was elastic from his sock or his shoe or something. A catapult is just another name for a slingshot. Okay? And so catapult and slingshot would be synonyms. All right, so the conflict in this chapter, there's a lot more than just this one conflict, but I picked one that's really stands out in this story, and that's a man versus nature conflict, because in this story, it talked about how Joseph got in trouble on purpose so he could get put into the cooler, that was playing into his plan for escape, okay? So when I read that, it said that Joseph had to be careful not to lay down and go to sleep, or he might not ever wake up, okay? Because it was so cold in there. That's why it's called the cooler. In the wintertime, if a prisoner got put in there, they would absolutely freeze to death and they would die. But he's in there, it's the springtime, it's not as cold, but if he were to lay down and go to sleep, he really was in danger of not being able to wake up because he would have died from the cold in there. All right, next we're going to talk about our text connection, and this is a text connection for me. You can think about a text connection that's specific to you, but I was thinking text to text because this story being set in World War II made me think about the novel that we read in the fall, which was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Remember, we called it LWW. But it also made me think of that book that some of you have read for your 40 book adventure called Number the Stars. Both of those are great books, but all three of these books are set in World War II. So when I think of one book like Escape from Warsaw, which I call EFW, when I think of EFW, it makes me think of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe and Number the Stars. And then lastly, I'm going to think about a summary. Now, if I were to ask you to give a one-sentence summary of this chapter, what do you think you would say? Let's think about what actually happened in the chapter. At the beginning of the chapter, Joseph is in his classroom. He's teaching his scripture lesson. He turns the picture of Hitler towards the wall so it's not showing. That's the instigating thing, okay? That's the first event. The next thing that happens is he is taken away and thrown into the prison camp at Zakina. And then the last thing that happens at the end of the chapter, well, what do you think? Yes, he is sick. Well, he walks out the front gate, so he escapes. We'll find out later if he's successful. Okay, so I combined all those things into a one sentence summary. It's not super descriptive, it's just bare bones. And it says Joseph was arrested and put into a Nazi prison camp from which he later escaped. Pretty simple one sentence summary of the chapter. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, in this chapter, pardon me, on this slide, I want you to think about that what happened and why. That cause and effect we've talked about a few times this semester. Okay? Um, it's really impossible to do this with two blank places on the slide, so I'm going to fill in one. Okay, so we're going to start with the why. Joseph Belitsky turned the picture of Hitler toward the wall during the scripture lesson. This is the why. What did it cause to happen? What was the effect of that? Now, if I've done this right, you should be able to write in what happened. We'll give it a try. All right, I'm going to go to the next slide. All right, so let's think about a story map. You might have done a story map before when you were done with a novel, but we're going to do one here for just chapter 1. Okay, so the setting of chapter 1, what did we say it was? Yes, we said it was the Zakina prison camp. Who was the main character of chapter 1? Yes, it is Joseph Belitsky. What is his problem? He turned the picture of Hitler toward the wall during the scripture lesson. Pardon me. And this caused something. What happened to Joseph as a result of him turning the picture over during the scripture lesson? Hint, we just talked about it. Okay? And once you fill in what happened to him, then I want you to tell me how that problem was resolved. How did he solve his problem? What did he do? Type that in, and then you're done. And I will read chapter 2 of Escape from Warsaw to you tomorrow.